Alright guys, Murphs here, and today I want to announce the launch of the Friendly Fire series here on the channel. In the Friendly Fire series, we'll be evaluating firearms out of my friends' collections so that we can kind of take my same methodology, apply it to somebody else's setup, and see how things work out. Maybe challenge some of my preconceived notions, but also give you guys an opportunity to be able to evaluate things from a different point of view and see if maybe there's something that works a little bit better for you. So with that, the first gun we're going to go over in the series is going to be this, a CZ75 SP-01 Phantom chambered in 9mm. Now, in order to talk about this handgun, we're going to talk about a little bit of history. In 1975, CZ, or, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but I'm at least going to try it, Česká Bojovka, introduced the CZ75 pistol, which was the best handgun to come out from behind the Iron Curtain. Now, this handgun would become very popular in Europe with some following in the United States. It would actually be an early import from Eastern Europe. But, or I guess I should say, super popular, created its own line of handguns, including a tactical model, the CZ75 SP-01, which had an all-steel frame and a Picatinny rail running across the dust cover. Now, being all-steel, it was rather heavy, and manufacturers over the years have, of course, sought to be able to supply lighter weight options of their handguns to the market. Now, for a long time, alloys were utilized, but eventually, as polymer became more viable for handgun frames, polymer started to find its way into different product lines for hammer-fired guns, specifically because we're talking in the early 80s, mid-80s really, with the introduction of the Glock and onto American shores. There was an interest in lightweight polymer handguns. However, a lot of police departments were not necessarily sold on the idea of striker-fired handguns. They preferred the perceived safety of a double-action hammer. The idea being that an officer would really have to want to take that first shot in a given situation because the trigger pull is going to be so long. Now, personally, I don't think safety should be derived from triggers. That sounds like a recipe for disaster, in my own opinion. But I do think there are some advantages to hammer-fired guns in general, and I appreciate that a lot of manufacturers decided to introduce polymer frame versions in order to be able to keep their product lines afloat. So that is where we get this. The Phantom variant has a polymer frame. Now, this handgun would actually wind up being adopted by the Czech military, or at least one entire brigade adopted this particular handgun, which I found very interesting. I didn't know that prior to doing the research for this video. Now, this handgun would be discontinued in 2019. But it would see some importation in the United States beforehand. All right, that pretty much covers history. Why don't we go ahead and start to talk about features on this particular handgun. All right, so right off the bat, we have a 4.6-inch barrel, which when I initially looked at this handgun, I really thought that it was going to be a longer barrel. I thought easily 5 inches, if not a little bit longer, something that was going to be more akin to a Glock 34. But now that I look at it, knowing that it's a 4.6-inch barrel, it kind of makes a little bit more sense, but there's just something about how this gun is laid out, the lines and the layout of this handgun just makes it look longer, which I'm pretty sure that's an affliction that more of us wish we had. But on top of our slide, we have these low-profile combat-style sights. They are 3-dot sights with photoluminescent paint. Now, I talked about the photoluminescent paint in the SP-07 video, which, if you're interested in that, see the link in the description. Photoluminescent paint is a type of paint that gets charged by sunlight and glows in the dark. And my issue with photoluminescent paint is that that the glow eventually dies out and you have to recharge it with light. So specifically, when the CZ-P07 was my bedside gun, I would have glowing night sights when I went to sleep, but when I woke up in the morning, they would be dead. And generally, I wake up pretty early in the morning. So there's some point in the middle of the night, at those critical peak hours for something to go wrong, that I don't have night sights. Now, it doesn't take very long to charge them. You hit them with a flashlight real quick, turn on your bedside light, they will get charged. However, I have to perform that additional action, and introducing light might negatively impact your situation. So I would prefer something that is more plug and play. That is why my current bedside gun has tritium night sights. That is something that I would change about this personally. At some point I'll put tritium night sights on the CZ-P-07 as well. Now, you'll see that we also have some serrations up here on the slide in order to reduce glare. I've never really noticed glare to be an issue on handguns, but you know, perhaps it is. I guess for sure it's not going to be at this point. Now, you'll note that our slide is very thin, which is potentially problematic if you're someone like me who overhand racks, but I can still get a grip. We'll talk about the grip here more in just a little bit. However, this is what causes a lot of people to say that CZ has a very low bore axis. However, let's go ahead and do a real quick comparison. I have a Glock 34 here, also previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. And if we put the back straps together on these handguns, we'll see that the Glock actually has a little bit lower bore axis. Now, of course, Glocks do have really low bore axis. It's one of the great things about Glocks in general. And this definitely has lower bore axis than, say, a SIG P226, but it doesn't have the super low bore axis that a lot of people like to attribute to it. However, it does still have positive features because of how it's arranged that give you the same properties, the same positive properties as a low bore axis. So specifically, with this thin slide, you don't have a lot of reciprocating mass going above your hand, causing the gun to become really flippy as it recoils against the web of your hand whenever you're gripping the pistol. This small amount of slide doesn't really do that. It allows the gun to stay relatively flat, which makes it easier to be able to get your faster follow-up shots, stay on target, all those types of things. In addition to that, this also has beefier rails than what you'll commonly find on polymer framed handguns. Now, this does still have slightly smaller rails than what an actual all-steel CZ-75 would have, but it still has more contact surface, which allows the gun to continue to track very flatly so that you don't get a lot of muzzle flip and potentially lose sight of your target and all that kind of stuff. It makes staying on target a lot easier. I really appreciate that as a feature. It gives you the same positive attributes as bore axis, just not actually that low. Now we'll talk about our slide serrations real quick. Our slide serrations are fairly deeply cut, and there's actually a dish cut into the slide that the serrations are set into that really gives a lot more contact surface with your hand, which I greatly appreciate, especially since like I mentioned before, I overhand rack. You also have these shoulders right here, which are a great place in order to be able to grip the slide as well. You've got a lot of opportunity to be able to put leverage on this small amount of slide. The surface area that is available has been put to good use, and I appreciate that. All right, now you'll note here that we have a rail dust cover just like on the SP-01. We have a squared off trigger guard that does have some texturing across the front if you're somebody who grips the front of your trigger guard. Let's go ahead and talk about our controls here real quick. You'll see that we have this very spacious, rather large slide release lever right up here. Now, some people like to argue about whether or not it's a slide release or a slide catch. I don't really care. A properly designed latch should work as both, in my opinion. It gives the shooter more opportunity to be able to exert his preference at that point. Now, my issue with this slide release actually is that it's set very far forward. And this is very normal for CZ handguns to set that pretty far forward. As we can see, I cannot reach it with my firing thumb without breaking my grip and rotating the handgun a little bit. Is that a big deal? It depends. If you run slide releases, then yes, I think it's a big deal. If you don't, if you overhand rack like I do, it's really not a big deal to begin with, and that's why I overhand rack anyway. Now, there are a couple opinions that come in here as well. So there are only two things that I feel like I have to operate with my firing hand, and that is dropping the magazine and turning off the safety. Those are the only things that I feel that should have to be accessible with my firing hand. Everything else is an administrative task that can be performed with my support hand. If you're somebody who runs the slide release, I would say that you need three things at that point: safety, magazine release, and then slide release should also be accessible with your firing hand. However, there are some people out there who train to activate the slide release with their support hand during a reload. And I played with this somewhat with this handgun, but I've got to say overall, I'm not a big fan. I find that I would sooner just seek building my grip as opposed to trying to get this to do something else. A lot of that probably just has to do with training. If I spent more time actually working on it, I could maybe get it fairly fast. But for me personally, this doesn't work out. I know plenty of people who do run it that way, and they would probably not even miss a beat on this handgun. I'm just not a big fan. If I did run slide releases, I would probably just rotate the gun, hit that slide release, and then get back into action. If that was a practice that I wanted to start taking up. Now, also, we have our decocker located right here. I have a little bit of an issue with this decocker. Now, once again, it's an administrative function, so it's fine if this is completed, if this is a task that is completed with my support hand. That doesn't bother me. I don't like the placement though, and I don't like how small it is. I feel like they could have given this a little bit more of a ledge, which would have made it easier to activate and a little bit more comfortable to activate. And actually, I have a little bit of a comfort issue with the controls on this in general. I find that they're kind of sharp, and I keep feeling them abrade my hand as I'm shooting, which is regrettable, to say the least. However, it's kind of a preference thing. Maybe just I need to start wearing gloves or something along that line. I do wish that perhaps this was a time where a slide-mounted decocker would have been more advantageous as opposed to a frame-mounted decocker. Or the decocker could also have just been moved forward a little bit, because there is some usable space here. I think just a little bit of change would help out. Now, as you can see, we have a large ring hammer, and that when we activate the decocker, the hammer goes to a half cock position so that it's not resting against the firing pin and is indeed safe. Now, in general, I like decockers on hammer-fired guns. I am not a fan of safeties, like safety decockers, like on a M9 or a 92 FS. I'm not a big fan of safety decockers. I would prefer to just lower the hammer safely, and then the gun is not going to just randomly go off at that point. I feel safety is redundant. So I really appreciate that this has a decocker. Now, it is a DA SA gun, as we've already discussed, and I've got to tell you guys, this trigger is amazing. In fact, between the two, the double action trigger and the single action trigger, I actually think the double action trigger is more remarkable. It's not to say that the single action trigger isn't good, just that I like the double action trigger a lot. Now, in addition to that, the reset on this gun is a little long, and you do have to come back onto the wall after reset. The reset does not put you right back at the wall, so that's a little bit of a regret. But overall, it's a good trigger, and we'll talk about that more once we get into shooting. Now, our magazine release is slightly extended and is placed here in the American position at the heel of the trigger guard. Our grip is wonderfully contoured. It's very long, very narrow, which unfortunately I do have a little bit of a complaint on how narrow the grip is, specifically because the fingers of my firing hand dig into the palm of my support hand whenever it is that I'm shooting, the fingernails specifically. So a couple of things that go along with that. A, I should probably trim my fingernails, and then B, if I swapped out the back strap, that might help out a little bit with that. This does come with replaceable back straps. You can see here we have a fair amount of texturing. It's actually pretty good texturing. It's not overly aggressive to where it's like tearing up my hands, but it's enough to be able to get a firm purchase on. Now, we also have a lovely beaver tail and pretty nice undercut on the trigger guard to allow us to get a nice high grip on the handgun. I appreciate that. The Phantom comes with 18-round magazines, just like the SP-01 did. You can also fit CZ75 magazines into this grip. So if you're wanting something that's more flush with the grip, you would go with the CZ75 mags. And we also have a lanyard loop for anybody who needs to run retention on their handgun for some reason. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? I lost my target. Amazingly, that is how this thing shoots. I absolutely love shooting this handgun. So first off, recoil. It's a 9mm handgun. It doesn't recoil heavily. However, it shoots impressively flat. It is very easy to stay on top of the sights to be able to continue to drive through that target. This thing's fantastic. It's a very, very fast handling handgun in that regard. I would actually, perhaps in the hands of a more competent shooter, would say that this could run just as fast as a lot of handguns that have like porting and stuff like that. This does so through passive means, and I like passive options. So porting and compensators and all that kind of stuff are cool in order to be able to help the gun stay flat, but it's something that you're adding on, you're potentially impacting the function of the handgun. This handgun functions just fine and tracks flat. That's awesome. Now the double action trigger on this is absolutely glassy smooth. It is so easy to stay on target. Double action rounds are generally spot on target. Now keep in mind, guys, a lot of the training that I've been doing here recently and how I generally train with handguns and rifles is for me to pursue small targets. So I put out like 2-inch target circles and I shoot at those. And especially if I'm doing speed drills or something along those lines, I don't necessarily expect to stack all of my hits, all rounds fired on those 2-inch circles. I prefer that the impacts be close to the 2-inch circle within what would be an A box and preferably on the 2-inch target circle. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. And a lot of times it doesn't. This handgun does a really good job of keeping them on that target. There were quite a few times I was shooting transition drills and stuff like that, and I would have way more rounds on the 2-inch circle than off. Even with the double action, single action transition that a lot of people mess up. Now, keep in mind, I train quite a bit with hammer fired guns. So that transition from double action to single action doesn't normally cause me a whole lot of issues, but for some, it does. This handgun makes it really easy. It makes it easy to be accurate. I have run this out to 16 yards, shooting at 2-inch circles and managed to keep all rounds fired on them. I was shooting 3-round shot groups on that particular day. This thing is just absolutely nuts as a shooter. So with that being the case, what are my recommendations when it comes to this handgun? That unfortunately is a little bit more nuanced of a conversation. So it's great that you have the Picatinny rail and all that kind of stuff, and you put lights and lasers and all the things that you want to throw on here. However, the issue becomes aftermarket support. Now, I can't decide how this issue comes about. I don't know if there's an importation issue with CZ to where either their government or our government is making it difficult for product to come in from the Czech Republic, or if it's a matter of there not being enough interest in the United States market for CZ to really import a lot of guns. If the problem is the latter, then I would say that that's something that is squarely CZ's fault, because I do think there's a demand for CZ products. I think that the issue becomes that not enough products come in fast enough to be able to feed into that demand. So while guys are sitting there going, man, I'd really love to get, whatever CZ handgun, but it's not available, fine, I'll just go buy a Glock. I'll just go buy a SIG. Like, they wanted something that was different and still good, but they couldn't get access to it, so they wound up just taking whatever it was that they could find, and then when the guns do come around, well, it's too late. They've already invested money into that new handgun, they've already been training with it and all that kind of stuff. They see no need to drop it or dump it in order to start all over again with a new gun. So, because of that, that impacts the availability of aftermarket parts and accessories, so holsters, Even something so simple as holsters can be kind of difficult to find, especially once you start mounting lights on the handgun, because lights in general will limit some of your options for holsters with any brand. But guns like, manufacturers like Glock and SIG and Smith & Wesson and all those have enough aftermarket support that you can still find the holster that you want or the holster that you're allowed to have, because that's the other aspect of it. If you're wanting to use this for duty or something along those lines, your organization might have requirements for what your duty holster can look like, whatever type of levels of retention it can have, or what manufacturers you can get it from and all that kind of stuff. And if they don't have something available for your chosen light and handgun, that doesn't help you at all. And that's one of the issues that you run into with CZ handguns. So when it comes to recommendations on this, I would not necessarily recommend this as a duty handgun working for an actual organization. I would recommend this as a competition handgun for the stock divisions, because I think this absolutely would slay when it comes to a stock division. Just the trigger's that good, the overall setup of the handgun is that good. It wants to perform, and all you have to do is just show up and be able to perform. I think this would be a great competition handgun in that respect. On your battle belt or something along those lines, again, if you can find a holster, a lot of times you're going to wind up having to go with custom options, which is going to add time and money to the equation. But you would not be wrong to run this as your kind of go-to-war setup. Like I can understand that at the kind of like a SHTF type deal, or something that you're going to take to courses and all that kind of stuff. Given that you can find the parts and accessories that you need, this would be a great choice for that. All right, so I guess the big question becomes, would I buy it? And that is a little more difficult to answer. Presently on my gun list, there's not really a category that this would fit into. But a couple of years ago, I did want a CZ handgun in general, and I wound up picking up the CZ P-07. So if I didn't have the CZ P-07, I would absolutely buy this handgun. But I also am not in a rush to get this handgun because I have the CZ P-07. I wouldn't get rid of the CZ P-07 in order to have this, if that makes any sense. So would I buy it? Conditionally, yes. If the owner of this handgun were to come up to me and say, man, I was really thinking about getting rid of it, I would think long and hard about picking this up off of him. For sure. Which, hey man, we'll talk later. Anyway, so what about competitive offerings out on the market? Well, with this handgun being discontinued, if you were looking for something with the same or similar kind of feature set, I would say you need to look at a CZ P-09. A little bit higher capacity, a little bit better layout, and still in production. Because I like how the PO series does their decocker a little bit better than I do on this particular handgun. So, all right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular handgun. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.